And here we go. So we're up to number 5, political theory, contracts, rights, and human nature. And next week's final session, by the way, I've changed the description of the topic a little bit. As you say, I listed it as pluralism, toleration, and the revival of humanism. As I was putting it together, it tilted and bent a little way away from what I had originally planned. But I think this will be more interesting. Anyhow, we've been talking a lot about science, the philosophy of mind, epistemology, mathematics, and now we'll begin the last couple of sessions to look at social and political theory a bit. And the 17th century turned the same kind of analytic observation that they had in the science labs to human nature and the political realm. And at the core of it, of course, and this is why the 17th century is such an interesting pivotal moment in European history, because it sits in an age after the Protestant Reformation, which questions authority just everywhere and in every which way, and in an age that saw the rise of the great religious wars. And so the fundamental practical question of the age, whether it was coming from theological discourse or political battlefield, was the question of political legitimacy. How does one arrive at it? What are the claims? Because clearly the traditional claim, which would have been a claim vested in God's will as expressed through the church, which in effect had in medieval feudal relationships had cut a deal with the temporal powers that be. The two arms, the secular arm and the religious arm, hand in hand, that had fallen apart. And so it's a wide open question. So for centuries, the Pope maintained a stable arrangement with the Holy Roman Empire, the only issue being who was to take temporal precedence, the emperor or the Pope. There was no question of legitimacy. We knew what the sources were. It was just the question of which of the two princes should have primacy at the moment. The reformers, the Protestant reformers' challenge to papal political authority created two questions. What is the relationship of church and state? Is there a relationship of church and state? Should there be a relationship of church and state? And who or what confers legitimacy on each side? When Protestant theology fractures the idea of a church, even though everyone was claiming that they were the church, there's just fragments, shards, splinters, and there is no easy answer to the question universally of the church being in command. So Reformation individualism is at the root of the splintering. Luther validates the individual conscience and the defense of every man's right to read and interpret scripture on his or her own. And this opens the gate for an explosion of new ideas. Once you say sola scriptura, scripture alone, and endorse the legitimacy of the individual conscience, once you do that, the whole set of controls blows up. The old consensus, which was once accepted uncritically, is gone. Now every principle must be argued, must be defended. So Now, born in this period, because of the strengthening nation states in the post-medieval period, are monarchs who will claim absolute authority, and they will make an ideology of it. So James VI of Scotland, who comes down from Scotland, becomes James I of England, and here he is in fancy dress. The first of the great Stuart kings of England, and the man who sponsors the King James Bible. He is going to write a book, the theory of, and in which the theory of divine right will be asserted. And so one stream of claims through the 17th century, leading up to the Sun King, Louis XIV, Louis XIV, is this absolute claim on absolutism. Monarchy has been in the ascendant in the 16th and 17th centuries, mainly because of changes in warfare and the proliferation of money. The aristocracy has been outflanked by an emerging bourgeoisie, and they can cut a deal, the capitalist class, directly with monarchs. We can cut out the feudal claims of the old aristocracy, which was the case in several places. And so, because what the new monarchies really need is capital, because of the scale of warfare now with gunpowder weaponry has and massive armies, the armada that Spain uses against England, had they ever been able to land, was just spectacular. But nothing in medieval warfare ever approached it. The armies of Henry V at places like Agincourt, 2,000 knights, this was nothing. And monarchy flexes its muscle. It was not a tradition. There was an imperial tradition coming out of Rome that the Holy Roman Empire tries to claim, but monarchy by and large is a novelty in this period. Absolutism is a novelty. The feudal system had given discrete rights to other elements of the ruling classes, to the clergy and to the aristocracy. The feudal system was a contract system, which everyone had roles, everyone had rights, everyone had responsibilities. This claim to absolutism is really brand new in the 16th, 17th centuries. And here comes James of Scotland and England, and he writes the true law of free monarchies. And we have evolved to this higher level, and God has given us this right. It's written into the nature of things. Divinity is at the core. Let me make sure this phone goes dead. I thought I had it. Sorry about that. Now, with the rise of the Calvinists, the reform branch, the radical reform branch of Protestantism, they regard legitimacy as deriving from covenants between church and God. And often, by the way, these groups are called covenanters, some of the radical Protestant sects. And the covenants were seen, and they interpreted the Bible this way, by the way. They go back to the Old Testament and see a covenant with Abraham and a covenant with Moses. The covenants were pacts that centered on theological issues of grace and salvation. You're my people, you owe me this sort of worship. I grant you the honor of being my people, and you will prosper on earth, and you will defeat your enemies, and that's the deal. Since the Reformed Church, and by the way, you still find that sense of covenant very powerful in some Protestant churches and in Judaism, where the idea that there is a deal that was made between God and the people of Israel. So you get, in effect, I'm going to move this phone out of the room. And there we go. Again, sorry about that. So you find rabbis in the Judaic tradition arguing with God. How can you let this happen to your people? Why this pogrom? Why this Holocaust? Because we had a deal. So this idea of covenant gets very reinforced among Protestant reformers as well. Now, since the Reformed Church, as they perceive it, is the collection of saved individuals, not a corporate body like the Catholic Church. The pact was between each person and God. So at the root of covenanting is this individualism that we also associate with the rise of the new capitalism of the urban centers of Western Europe. The propertied individuals banding together individually as groups, but the group is not a monolith. It is an agreed upon covenant that each individual has to step into and lend their support to. This position was common to all the Reformed churches, the Scottish Presbyterians, the French Huguenots, English Puritans, the New England Pilgrims. They were there by contract. So the movement in theory and political theory from covenant to actual contract starts taking place in the late 16th century and flourishes in the 17th century. It's in the 17th century when we get the full force of so-called social contract theory. A man who was instrumental, a 16th century figure who was instrumental in this development, was this radical Presbyterian by the name of George Buchanan, who was a humanist and poet. He was the teacher, by the way, of Michel de Montaigne. In his book, The Right of the Kingdom in Scotland, now remember, Scotland is Presbyterian, not Church of England. It's very low church. It's very radical. It's very Calvinist in its sympathies. He develops a political theory of a social contract, more than a church theory. He now pushes it as a political theory. In the state of nature, he uses the phrase, a social contract is made between people and their rulers, according to which the people retain their sovereignties and their rights. So there is no absolute submission and a sacrifice of all rights to a monarch. The Mayflower Compact of 1620, among the Pilgrims in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it forms a, quote, civil body politic to enact laws and offices for the Commonwealth. It is a compact. It is a social contract. King James's book on divine right, when he wrote that, it was directly in response to Buchanan. James, coming from Scotland, would have been very aware of what the church was pushing at this point in time. Now, into the 17th century, of course, in England, it falls apart. The English Civil War, which had been precipitated for decades, but breaks into pure civil war, and that lasts for 20 years, an entire generation of civil war, much longer than the American Civil War of the 19th century. Charles I, the son of James, he resists parliamentary demands for a constitutional monarchy. They're trying to share power, the commons, with the monarch. They want to put limits on this claim of absolute authority. He asserts absolutist prerogative. He levies taxes without parliamentary consent. And think ahead to the American Revolution. That's going to occur in another 125 years. And they're going to use the claims of the commons in the English Civil War as the reason to justify the rebellion of the colonies. No taxation without consent, without representation. He also marries a Catholic, which the commoners were not in love with. He triggers a war, and he's executed after much to and fro. In 1649, you actually get a regicide. And there's a little picture there of Charles I being publicly executed. One of the elements in the Civil War that I wanted to focus on, because it has such implications for the future, in the Reformed Puritan Army, the Parliamentary Army, as it was called, there were these Puritan elements that were known as levelers, people who wanted, if you will, a social leveling. Extreme elements among the so-called Roundheads because of the haircuts, the Puritan haircuts. Instead of the flowery wigs, we had the simple sort of page boy haircuts, the Prince Valiant haircuts, I guess, from the cartoon. This group of levelers later become known as diggers. Their name came from their belief in absolute economic equality, based on biblical passages, of course. And they tried to reinvent the social order grounded in this ideal of small, egalitarian, agrarian communities, diggers. And do you remember how many of the counterculture of the 1960s would refer to themselves as diggers as they ran to Vermont and started hoeing their beet potato crops? They're regarded as forerunners, of course, of later anarchist and agrarian socialist movements, and they will be cited by political theorists of the left for the next couple of hundred years. Now, in 1647, within that army, the parliamentary army, the so-called New Model Army of Oliver Cromwell, there were a series of discussions that were taken down and disseminated, printed. The debates were printed. They're referred to as the Putney Debates because of where they took place. A number of the participants in the debates were levelers. And the debate was about the makeup of a new constitution for Britain. The radicals wanted a constitution based upon manhood suffrage, one man, one vote, biennial parliaments, and a reorganization of parliamentary constituencies. Now, within the parliamentary army, the grandees, people like Cromwell himself, were no levelers. They wanted concessions and reform, but to men of property. It was actually the emergent bourgeoisie that wanted their just due at the expense of the traditional aristocracy of the robe, the traditional aristocracy of the sword. This was the new aristocracy. We are the men powering the economy of this kingdom. We want our voices to be heard in, if you will, in direct proportion to the influence that we have in supporting the kingdom. So a couple of excerpts, just on this one slide, a few excerpts from the Putney Debates, because in it you will hear for the first time the arguments of radical equality being opposed by the idea of the rights of property, that property has a right, not just people, but people of property have a significantly greater right. So the speakers are, there's Colonel Thomas Rainsborough, who speaks for the radicals. And for the grandees, we have Henry Ireton, who's Cromwell's son-in-law. First, we have Rainsborough in a very famous passage that you'll hear quoted throughout Whig history, the liberal history of England for the next couple of hundred years. For really, I think that the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the greatest he. And therefore, truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government. And I do think that the poorest man in England is not at all bound in a strict sense to that government that he has not had a voice to put himself under. So, if you will, it is the poorest he has as much right as the greatest he. And Ireton, speaking in opposition, for my part, I think it is no right at all. I think that no person has a right to an interest or share in the disposing or determining of the affairs of the kingdom, and in choosing those that shall determine what laws we shall be ruled by here. No person has a right to this that has not a permanent fixed interest in this kingdom. And those persons together are properly the represented of this kingdom, and consequently are also to make up the representers of this kingdom, who taken together do comprehend whatever is a real or a permanent interest in the kingdom. And what is real and what is permanent? It is property. He goes on, the meanest man in England ought to have a voice in the election of the government he lives under, but only if he has some local interest. I say this, that those that have the meanest local interests, that man that has but in the famous amount that was always applied to voting rights in England for centuries, the 40-shilling freehold. That man that has but 40 shillings a year, he has as great a voice in the election of a knight for the shire as he that has 10,000 a year or more. So that great liberal in the raw sense of the term liberal, meaning free market liberalism, that great liberal theory that only people who have a stake, something to lose, a property, a value, money, if you will, wealth, if you will have the sobriety to rule. They will not do frivolous things. They will not take radical courses. They will be sobered by the fact that they have something to lose. And only these people of property should be electors of the sovereign ruler. And Rainsborough, in response to that, says, I don't find anything in the law of God that a lord shall choose 20 burgesses and a gentleman but 2, or a poor man shall choose none. I find no such thing in the law of nature, nor in the law of nations. And so, if you will, what will become the political debate certainly into the 20th, and as it looks now, into the 21st century, the terms of it are being laid in political theory right here. The continent, of course, is not spared from the chaos that was wrought by the Protestant Reformation. It itself is the center of the most savage of the religious wars, the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. Initially, it's a war of religion within the Holy Roman Empire between Catholic and Protestant states. A new emperor tries to impose Catholicism on the Holy Roman Empire. A Protestant union forms versus the Catholic Union. And you see how every state in Europe virtually, but remember, the Holy Roman Empire is a pastiche of like 150 teeny German states. There was no Germany in this period. All these separate states sort of under the blanket of the Holy Roman Empire. Everybody joins up on some or other. The French get involved, and you get odd affiliations. You will get the French fighting on various sides depending on what they think their foreign policy advantages are at a given moment. And I don't want to look at the details of this war, just to say that it winds up morphing into a war of the great powers. By 1635, France enters the war directly on the Protestant side, even though it's a Catholic country. All the enemies of the Habsburg expansion unite. At the end of the war, there's a peace, a practical, we're going to be talking about this in the next class also, a practical toleration simply because somebody wants to stop the bloodletting. Everybody wants to stop the bloodletting. It becomes the first of the modern international balance of powers that's put in place, out of which comes a Dutch republic freed from the control of Habsburg Spain. And so the Dutch Golden Age that we mentioned along the way begins as a result of these wars. But it becomes a trigger for new kinds of political and social thought. It's the age of political theory. Political and religious institutions had been fractured. Claims were made for both absolute monarchy on one hand and republicanism on the other hand. And now what's going to happen is that the new scientific spirit that we've been talking about through the previous sessions is going to enter this discussion. You're going to have people thinking like experimentalists saying, okay, back to the drawing board. If we don't have the authority of God, if biblical authority is not going to justify people recognizing the sovereignty of whatever government happens to be claiming authority, what are we going to fall back on? Where is legitimacy going to come from? What is the claim going to look like? If we can't say, okay, let's go back to the book of Isaiah, let's go back to the laws of Moses, let's go back to the New Testament. If we can't say that, what do we say? And so a more than a cottage industry begins. Early forays into it are discussions of natural law. Now, in the scholastic period, natural law was a thing, it was an idea, but it was seen as nothing more than the expression of God's will. So they call it voluntarist natural law. Ever since Aquinas, natural law was interpreted as the will of God, and all you had to do is prove what God willed by going back to scripture and the like. The normative categories, the ought, what is justice, what is goodness, what is virtue, were created by the will of God. If God hadn't willed it so, it's like the parent with the child. Why do I have to do this? Because I said so. Why did you say so? Because I wanted you to. It's the act of will being imposed. Now, the great Dutch jurist, Hugo de Groot, known by his Latin last name, Hugo Grotius, who lives up until the mid-17th century. He's a jurist, he's a lawyer, he's a diplomat, he's a political philosopher. His major work is called The Law of War and Peace, De Jure Belli ac Pacis. And he talks a lot about international law between nations and establishes, if you will, the whole legal practice of laws of the high seas and negotiations between states. But he does a lot more than that. You see, we have him in one of those frilly Dutch collars, painted in 1631. He argues that ethical and political norms aren't the product of God's will, but they arise from human nature. And the law of nature is a dictate of right reason, which points out that an act, according as it is or is not in conformity with rational nature, has in it a quality of moral baseness or moral necessity. The morality of the action is inherent in whether it is rational, as rationality is the earmark of human nature. And then in consequence, such an act is either forbidden or enjoined. Human nature is a balance, as he sees it, between two essential properties: the drive for self-preservation, which is shared with all animals, and sociability, the need for society. He says, among the traits characteristic of man is an impelling desire for society, that is, for the social life, not of any and every sort, but peaceful and organized according to the measure of his intelligence. With those who are of his own kind, the social trend is called sociableness. So ethical and political norms would even apply without divine sanction. We don't have to introduce biblical discussion into making cases for what laws should be or where legitimacy derives from. And in fact, appeals to Scripture would just lead us into more battles. We have just spent 100 years beating each other over the head because of variant interpretations of Scripture. Let's do away with the question of divine sanction. These people all believed in God, and they all were members of churches of one sort or another, but they realized that using divine sanction as the endorsement for legitimacy was not going to get anywhere. So they just table it. Let's just put it over here on a shelf. Whatever we privately believe about that, the public case has got to be made about what is human nature, what is rationality, what are the needs of human nature, self-preservation, and then, as he puts it, sociability, and how do we get legitimacy proceeding from that? What we have been saying would have a degree of validity, even if we should concede that which cannot be conceded without the utmost wickedness. I'm still religious, that there is no God, or that the affairs of men are of no concern to him. This is a radical departure from scholastic thought. Let's pursue our discipline, making the assumption, the concession, the assumption, although it's wicked, that there is no God. Let's begin there, which is why later on, God will be mentioned very little in the Constitution of the United States, for instance. He goes on, Grotius, to talk about the concept of right and the fact that right is subjective. He argues that right is a faculty of the individual, and therefore it's a power that precedes state authority. I have a right, or I have rights, and using the modern use of the term, I have rights that precede the authority of the state. Faculty, that right which a man has to his own, but we shall hereafter call it a right properly and strictly taken, under which are contained a power over ourselves, which is termed liberty. We have a right to liberty that the state can't take away. Natural law, which is rooted in human nature, confers right on rational human claims. We must further observe that this natural law does not only respect such things as depend not upon human will, but also many things which are consequent to some act of that will. Thus, property, for instance, as now in use, was introduced by man's will. And being once admitted, this law of nature informs us that it is a wicked thing to take away from any man against his will, which is properly his own. So his right to property, even though property, according to Grotius, is something that is made up by the will of man, you can't take it away from him. You can't dispense with a man's property. But these rights are transferable. He commoditizes rights. Since right is a faculty that I have as an individual, a subject, I can trade it. I can sacrifice some portion of my right. Why then would there not be as lawful for a people who are at their own disposal to deliver up themselves to one person or to several persons and transfer the right of governing them upon him or them, retaining no vestige of that right for themselves? So he's anticipating the idea of a social contract. Since you have this right, and this right is your faculty, and it is a commodity that you have, you can trade it. If there is value in banding together as a commonwealth, the compact of the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay Colony, if there is a value that can be traded away, we can elect officers and set up legitimacy in an authority over us. We've traded it for something of value. And we'll see what that trade-off is going to look like when we get into the next couple of theoreticians. Just as every right of the magistrate comes to him from the state, so has the same right come to the state from private individuals. And similarly, the power of the state is the result of collective agreement. State power is not the product of God's will, not the product of sheer force. It is the product of the willful transference of individual rights. It is a social contract. Well, went the wrong way, which leads us to the first of the great English contract theorists, Thomas Hobbes, who lives he's born, by the way, the year of the Armada, and he lives to the ripe old age of 91. He makes it all the way to 1679. But his floruit, the period in which he flourishes, of course, his height of his powers is the period 1640 to 1660 of the Civil War. In England, he is a witness to it, and he is duly horrified. He's often called the father of modern political philosophy. He's a judge, he's a historian. He also is something of a physicist, actually. His major works, Leviathan and De Quive, are classics of political theory. And we're going to stick with Leviathan here. The Leviathan, there's a picture of it over here. A Leviathan is this beast from the Old Testament, but as represented on the frontispiece of his book, it is the commonwealth made up of all the individuals who have ceded their authority to the sovereign king within the commonwealth. It is the new Leviathan. Anyhow, so he begins. Men are born in relative equality. Nature's made men so equal in the faculties of body and mind as that though there be found one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body or quicker of mind than another, yet when all is reckoned together, the difference between man and man is not so considerable. Whereas to the strength of body, the weakest has strength enough to kill the strongest. And he goes on to say, and even if there's somebody who's really strong, all it takes is 2 or 3 of us to gang up on him. So by and large, men are born relatively equal and not easily able to dominate, one dominating the other. A. Point B, they are naturally competitive and acquisitive. They're equal, but they want stuff. If 2 men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies and endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. They use violence to make themselves masters of other men's persons, wives, children, and cattle. They go after it all. As we are born into the world, and he posits this concept of a state of nature, and in the state of nature, by which he means the state prior to there being government and commonwealths of one kind or another. He doesn't speak of a state of nature literally. He doesn't think this is necessarily an evolutionary period that people go through. In fact, he sort of denies it, but he says, but if you look around the world, you'll see times and places where people seem to be living in a kind of a state of nature because there is no government authority that's controlling them. So he's sort of saying, well, if you can stumble upon small groups of hunter-gatherers in the Amazon jungle in the 16th century, and by and large, one could regard it as something close to a state of nature. So it's a conceptual theory more than it is a state as such. But in this state, as he hypothesizes it, it is the war, as he puts it, of all against all. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, unless there's a common power to keep men in awe, scare that bejesus out of them. They are in that condition which is called war. And such a war as is of every man against every man, all against all, as if of every man against every man, in which case everyone is governed by his own reason. It's gangsta out there. In such condition, there is no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain. How are you going to build a company and set up production lines and supply chains when it's the war of all against all? And it can all be broken and it could all be taken away. It's the Wild West out there. And consequently, there would be no culture of the earth, no agriculture. There wouldn't be navigation. There wouldn't be knowledge of the face of the earth, no geography, no account of time, no arts. Whoops, I need to flip that. No letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And perhaps the most famous phrase of the 17th century, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is Mad Max out there, the state of nature. He continues his argument. He says, okay, people are born equal, they're acquisitive and competitive, and the world in that circumstance is warfare, and life is brutal. There's no justice and no peace in the state of nature. The notions of right and wrong, he says, justice is injustice, have there no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. It follows that in such a condition, every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body. And therefore, as long as this natural right of every man to everything endures, there can be no security to any man. Sounds like a prison movie, right? Peace requires the sacrifice of liberty. He says, here we are left. So what can we do in this circumstance? From this fundamental law of nature by which men are commanded to endeavor peace. Remember, he's just been through the Civil War, is derived from the second law, that a man be willing to lay down this right to all things. You got a right to everything. Nobody's constraining you. Bop each other over the heads. But unless you lay down this right and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself, right is laid aside, either by simply renouncing it or by transferring it to another. And when a man has abandoned or granted away his right, then he is said to be obliged or bound not to hinder those to whom such right is granted, or abandoned from the benefit of it, that he ought, and it is his duty, not to make void that voluntary act of his own, that such hindrance is injustice and injury, the right being before renounced and transferred. You have to make a voluntary act of sacrificing your right to do whatever you want, and you can't revoke that voluntary act once it is made, because it is a social contract. And lastly, in that bottom paragraph, the motive and end for which this renouncing and transferring of rights is introduced is nothing else but the security of a man's person in his life. To save your life and to be secure, you have to sacrifice your right to choose just any old thing that you want. You must submit to the authority of this monarch in which you have vested authority, so that you do not have to fear for your life. You trade for security your right to do just about anything. And if a man by words or other signs seem to spoil himself of the end for which those signs were intended, he is not to be understood as if he meant it or that it was his will, but that he was ignorant. The mutual transferring of right is that which men call contract. You make a trade. So on the right, on the upper right, you have this New Yorker cartoon. Look, life is nasty, brutish, and short, but you knew that when you became a caveman. And you have this other cartoon on the bottom, which says, you don't kill me, I won't kill you. Hey, that sounds great. And we have a social contract. And here's Leviathan, done as cartoons. In the state of nature, man relentlessly pursues survival at the expense of others in a war of all against all. Second frame, good and evil are only what men make them. Man is fundamentally selfish, but rational and logical. Seek peace and follow it. They recognize that the war of all against all is only anarchy and renounce some of the rights by entering into a social contract. This creates an artificial man, a commonwealth, a Leviathan, in which the sovereign is the sum of the individuals, and it's personified in the authority of the state. And so we have Thomas Hobbes as the first formal foray into a political theory of where society comes from and how you legitimate it. And you do not need a God. You just need rational people in the state of nature saying, hey, this has scared the hell out of me being out here. I will sacrifice my right to be able to rape and rapine and steal and kill. I will sacrifice all of that. I will give my control of me in submission to a government that will have ultimate authority because it is the only way I can secure peace and the prospect of a reasonable future. And we move then, and here we have Le Sage Locke, again, the wise Locke, as Voltaire had it, who is nearly 2 generations younger than Hobbes. He's not born until 1632. So he's born 44 years after Hobbes. And the Civil War, which is over by 1660 when he is a young man, has resulted in something of a grudging compromise, which in 1689 and 1690, after the so-called 1688, it's the beginning of it, the so-called Bloodless Revolution, in which the Catholic James II, James Stuart II, is replaced by Parliament as king in a constitutional monarchy by the Protestant William of Orange, which is why the Protestants in Ireland are called Orangemen. The Protestant William of Orange from Holland, and he's confirmed the primacy of Parliament, confirmed the primacy of Parliament in the Bill of Rights of 1689. So he's removed from the Civil War. He lives in the age of the so-called Whig ascendancy, the big new men, the grandees of the aristocracy and of the new commercial classes, and he wants to move a theory that replaces Hobbes's theory with something closer to real constitutionality, in which not all authority is ceded to a monarch. And he returns to the idea of a state of nature. This is all, he writes 2 treatises of government that he publishes in 1689. The first one's a refutation of Sir Robert Filmer's defense of absolute monarchy. The second one is Locke attempting to explain his version of civil society and legitimacy. And he will return to a state of nature, but for him, it's going to look quite a bit different. It's not going to be the law of all against all. He does say, it's his first foray, that men are equal in the state of nature. I agree with Hobbes to this degree. To properly understand political power and trace its origins, we must consider that the state that all people are in naturally. That is a state of perfect freedom of acting and disposing of their own possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature. There's still a law of nature going on. And it's not a law of tooth and claw. People in this state do not have to ask permission to act or depend on the will of others to arrange matters on their behalf. The natural state is also one of equality, in which all power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, and no one has more than another. It is evident that all human beings, as creatures belonging to the same species and rank, and born indiscriminately with all the same natural advantages and faculties, are equal among themselves. They have no relationship of subordination or subjection. He says, okay, we agree so far. There's law in the state of nature, though. But though this be a state of liberty, it is not a state of license. And here is the first great departure from Hobbes. So the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So there is moral principle amenable to reason built into the state of nature. So instead of sort of this fantasy of lurid savages in a state of nature that we get from Hobbes, here in the state of nature, men are free, they are at liberty, but that there is a moral mandate, the product of human reason, that says you're not really supposed to hurt anybody else or steal what is theirs. And this is built into human nature as we come into the world, pre the legitimation of a commonwealth. It's natural, it's built in. This law of nature dictates that we respect the life, liberty, and he's going to start introducing the big word again, and the property of others. And being furnished with like faculties, sharing all in one community of nature, there cannot be supposed any such subordination among us that may authorize us to destroy one another, as if we were made for one another's uses, as the inferior ranks of creatures are for ours. Everyone, as he is bound to preserve himself, so by like reason, when his own preservation comes not in competition, ought he as much as he can to preserve the rest of mankind, and not unless it be to do justice on an offender, take away or impair the life, or what tends to the preservation of the life, the liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. So there is this kind of natural morality built into human nature. But now comes this really important and extraordinary leap. Men, he says, have property in the state of nature. Before you have government, before you have contracts, before you have compacts of any kind, there is property, the idea of property. Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men. Okay, so there's nature. And anybody can, pick a fruit off the tree or shoot a squirrel. Yet every man has a property in his own person. Okay, fundamentally, at root, the building block of all property for you is yourself. I've got me. I've got a right to me. Nobody can take this. That's my first property. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. So he introduces the ideas of labor and work. When your body does something, pulls the apple from the tree, that is a labor. Anything that you do is a work or labor, and you have the right to it because it's an extension of you. That's what you do with your own hands. Further, whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with it and joined to it something that is his own, thereby making it his property. In the act of picking the apple, in the act of making a teepee, in the act of killing a buffalo, you have joined the buffalo's there. The buffalo herd is running over the plains. Everybody's got a right to the buffalo. You killed the buffalo, however, and skinned the buffalo. You have mixed your labor with it, and the meat of that buffalo is now yours as a property, as a claim, which is naturally yours because it's an extension of the work of your body, the labor of your body, and your body is your property. So it's by extension, you've turned what is part of nature into private property. You set up the stakes, you take the covered wagon out, you put your property stakes in, and you cultivate that 640 acres or whatever it is of land, and it is your land. You have domesticated it, it is yours. It being by him removed from the common state nature placed it in, it hath by this labor something annexed to it that excludes the common right of other men. For this labor, being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, or at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. Oh, that's a loaded last couple of phrases, though. At least where there is enough. What happens if you claim the buffalo and there's not enough buffalo to feed everybody else and everybody else is starving? Then he's willing to suggest that, oh, maybe we have other claims on this property at that point. Okay. So what we have here is the first instance in the West of a labor theory of value. Property, ownership comes about in the state of nature by the application of labor to natural resources. So property and the rules of ownership comes before, is prior to the creation of government. So property and rights to property and moral law, if you will, social order exists pre-governmentally. Let's move on. Men in the state of nature may consensually agree to form a political body. Men being, as has been said, by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent, which is done by agreeing with other men. So the only way you get into a polity of any kind, a political community, is to join and unite into a community. And why would you do this? As he says there, for the comfortable, safe, and peaceable living one amongst another, and a secure enjoyment of their properties, and a greater security against any that are not of it. This any number of men may do, because it injures not the freedom of the rest. They are left as they were in the liberty of the state of nature. When any number of men have so consented to make one community or government, they are thereby presently incorporated and make one body politic, wherein the majority have a right to act and conclude the rest. For when any number of men have, by the consent of every individual, made a community, they have thereby made that community one body with a power to act as one body, which is only by the will and determination of the majority. And so everyone is bound by that consent to be concluded by the majority. And I will point out that he does say, because one of the objections to this part of the theory that were made by critics was that, hey, wait a minute, people are born under government that they didn't give assent to all along. And he says, well, guess what? On consideration, they have a right to leave it. So, as we'll see, he'll say something very directly to this later on. And it's a theme that's picked up by people like Thomas Jefferson. Revolution the leaving, the dismantling of that body is a right that the individuals still retain. Men are bound by this voluntary social contract, though, as long as they consent to live within that community. Whosoever, therefore, out of a state of nature united to a community must be understood to give up all the power necessary to the ends for which they unite into society to the majority of the community. And thus, that which begins and actually constitutes any political society is nothing but the consent of any number of free men capable of majority to unite and incorporate into such a society. And this is that, and that only, which did or could give beginning to any lawful government in the world. Revolution is possible. Men may withdraw from a particular contract. For there are no examples so frequent in history, both sacred biblical history and profane history, as those of men withdrawing themselves and their obedience from the jurisdiction they were born under. They leave, they fight back. And the family or community they were bred up in and settling up new governments in other places, from whence sprang all that number of petty commonwealths in the beginning of ages. It is true that whatever engagements or promises anyone has made for himself, he is under the obligation of them, but cannot by any compact whatsoever bind his children or posterity. For his son, when a man, being altogether as free as the father, any act of the father can no more give away the liberty of the son than it can of anybody else. But why do people enter these compacts then, if indeed all the good stuff is already available in the state of nature? And he says it quite bluntly. He's going to make the case that they form governments to preserve property, because there will be bad actors out there who will not play by the moral rules, and for increased security of property. We have governments, to which it is obvious to answer that though in the state of nature he has such a right to liberty and property, yet the employment of it is very uncertain, constantly exposed to the invasion of others. For all being kings, as much as he, every man is equal, and the greater part no strict observers of equity and justice, the enjoyment of the property he has in the state is very unsafe, very insecure. This makes him willing to quit this condition, which, however free, is full of fears and continual dangers. And it is not without reason that he seeks out and is willing to join in society with others who are already united or have a mind to unite for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates, which I call by the general name property. The great and chief end, therefore, of men uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of property. And in our final slide for today, it is the age of property. The ideals that we see, if we look at the portraiture of the Dutch Golden Age, we would have seen the same if we looked at England for the most part. Most aggressively in Holland, where the traditional aristocracies had been replaced altogether. This truly was a republic. In England, you still have the claims of a traditional aristocracy. And in France and Spain, at this point in time, of course, you still have the claims of an absolute monarch and an aristocracy in place. But you see in this age of the coming bourgeois revolutions of the 18th century to come, the early note of the Dutch Republic and the expression of property. Here you have the sober men of business, the syndics of the Drapers Guild on the left. I took two Rembrandts in this case, and the Portrait of a Gentleman on the right, both done more or less around 1660. You have this personified idealization of what political theorists have come to call the age of possessive individualism. Political theory in this period is going to be based on the twin pillars of property, the possession of property, and the individual, and the rights of the individual. And it's a series of political triumphs for the European bourgeoisie. Locke provided, as I say in the bottom, the ideological foundation of modern liberal theory, which places the ultimate value on individual liberty and property, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as we would have it. Voltaire's reference to the wise Locke, le sage Locke, aptly captured the sentiment of the 18th century, which saw in the American Constitution the consummation of a sensibility. This is why so many in the liberal tradition of European political theory saw in the American foundation and the American Constitution a glorious set of possibilities, and why America has always been a symbol of liberal ideals. And you understand, I'm using liberal in that sense of free property claims that the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries would have used for it. The political theory from Locke on is going to either be elaborations of his version of the justifications of property as expanded by people like in the Scottish Enlightenment, like people like David Hume and particularly Adam Smith, and in The Great Wealth of Nations, published in, I believe it was actually in 1778, either 6 or 8, I'm not sure. But the challenges that will be made to it by the claims of the disenfranchised as we enter the industrial age. Now, remember, Locke uses the model, and the American Constitution uses the model, and Thomas Jefferson uses the model of the small holder, the gentleman farmer with his family gathered on the farm, who goes to the town hall meetings, and property is still close to something that was hacked out of nature by the sweat of one's brow and the labor of one's hands. And in the industrial age, of course, that concept is put to the test because machine power aggregates the labor of millions of men and animals. We call it horsepower, don't we? How many horses do you have under that hood? And this extrapolation of labor through machine, the application of capital and machine technology produces such distortions of property distribution that, of course, the Lockean, Smithian, Humean theories of property and ownership are going to yield to claims based on principles laid down by Locke and Smith and the others, claims of fairness that will give rise to socialist and communist theories in the 19th century and other forms of utopian socialist theories in the 19th century, and the grand compromises of the 20th century of labor unions and what we have come to know as social democracy and the welfare state. So the claims of absolute property ownership, which were conceivably justified in a state of nature, in an agrarian production environment that the 17th century imagined, that the distortions that arise from that and the conditions that arise from that still could be built. Both worlds could still have recourse to concepts of fairness that were born in that Lockean theory. And one could suggest, one could argue that the material compromises made against property in the 20th and 21st centuries by social welfare democracies are Lockean in spirit as well. But the great tradition of political theory, the great questions of where you draw the line of the rights of individuals to property and the rights of individuals against the large aggregations of property, where those lines are drawn, how they're implemented through programs of taxation and the like for the social good, the compromises that are made between equal opportunity as an absolute on one side and equality as an absolute on the other side. That discussion is still going on. The terms of it were first uttered in the 17th century. And there we are. And I am going to stop the share. And I am going to, if I can find me, I'm going to remove the pin. And you should be able to see yourselves. Do anybody want to question or comment? And be sure to unmute yourself if you want to say something. All clear.
Not quite.
Okay, ask away.
Can you contrast like a major decision that would have been influenced by, Hobbesian thought versus the 17th century? So, for example, I was thinking of Columbus, coming to the Americas and basically taking the land versus slavery, in the 17th century. So in what way would people look at, their ability to take property and, basically crush, the indigenous society in the 15th century versus people who were affected by Hobbes and Locke regarding
that was even a question then. So, yeah, I mean, you raised a couple of points. Columbus claiming land, the idea of international law as looking back from the 17th century to previous time, monarchies having the right to claim unsettled land had always been assumed. In fact, almost with a Lockean mixing of labor, I got there first so I can claim it. Okay, the people on that land caused a real problem. So you get everything from the negotiation for Manhattan Island for trinkets, which recognizes the result of whatever tribe that was, to having property in the land I mean, that was something of an admission, the so-called negotiation of Peter Minuit and the Indians. Two, theories of subhumanity that would have been argued for the primitives as they would have perceived them, which is something I'm going to be talking about next week, actually. How primitives were, what they called primitives were regarded. And the justification, when justifications were made on the basis of we are bringing civilization and Christianity to these poor, benighted primitives to justify the horrors. So, in effect, until we get really to the early 18th century, I don't think that Lockean theory, which is mainly concerned about the European theater and the like, would have commented on the appropriation of indigenous peoples and their properties. I think when the advantages, the economic advantages of things like the slave trade had become obvious, then you had people scrambling to make justifications in terms of property theory and the like. I mean, just to justify the ownership of Africans, you know, to be used as a labor source. You would think on paper flies into the teeth of Lockean theory. It's their labor. They get to use it as they want. So where's the justification? You get people playing very fast and loose and needing theories of subhumanity, humanity versus subhumanity. And by the way, there was slavery in the ancient world, but there wasn't racialism in the ancient world. In other words, slavery was something that could happen politically to anybody by accident in the ancient world. You could just be in the wrong place at the wrong time and presto change, you're a slave. So you weren't subhuman. But now that we have this new theory of human rights, by the time we get to the 17th century, the only way you could enslave somebody is to claim that they weren't human. You have to racialize slavery and enslavement in the 17th and 18th century, or else there was no justification for it, given your own theories. In the ancient world, there's no theory. They're not running around making theories of right and states of nature. And so anybody, you know, hey, I'm the biggest guy in the block, you're working for me now. You know, I mean, the intellectuals in the Roman Republic were all taught by Greek slaves, the pedagogues, who were often freed after the training of the children, kind of thing. But you know, it was sort of a common thing. But it was not like, oh my God, isn't this Greek intellectual who can speak 7 languages an inferior form of subhumanity for which I get to force him to teach my children, you know, how to speak and write Greek? No. But that it's sort of an interesting take. I'm glad you asked that question. Maybe next week we'll have another angle on it, because I'm going to be talking about colonialism a little bit. I don't know whether that answered anything.
It did. Because that was my question too.
How would Locke have viewed the Civil War hearing? Wouldn't people have the right to disassociate themselves from the society?
I think That's an interesting question. I think he might have thought so. I think he might have thought so. And indeed, you realize you had a whole country and you had people split down the middle on that question. And remember this, there have been a number of, because of the political insanity of recent times, there have been people writing books about states' rights versus national rights, and the foundation of the American Republic, and how the Southern states only joined when they felt that there was a serious amount of protection built in for their individual rights as states to maintain economic slavery, for instance, that they weren't buying in unless that was guaranteed, the so-called 3/5 solution and all that kind of stuff. And so you get around to the Civil War, and there are a number of people saying, oh, you're not going to abide by slavery laws in the new states, west of the Mississippi. We have the right to claim that you're violating the spirit of the original agreement. So it's just my way of saying there were people who thought that it was a violation of the right to self-determination. Aren't there a lot of people who would have found themselves on the side of the Northern argument at that point in time, who, facing the exigencies of the 21st century, have said, maybe secession would be a good idea?
Think about it now. We could do without Texans.
Anyhow, with that said, I think we'll call it a day then. Enjoy the fall weather while we still have it, and see you for the last session next week.